The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Navient Solution Spotlight for the month of August. Today's topic is back to the basics with workflow. Just a couple quick housekeeping items before we get going here. Just wanted to let everybody know we are recording this webinar. Hence, everybody's voice is actually muted on this call. So if you do need to interact with me, please pose any questions. Frankly, within the questions box, if there's any issues whatsoever with the sound or what you're actually seeing during the webinar, please use the chat panel that appears within the GoToWebinar piece over there. And again, I want to take just a moment to encourage everybody to complete the survey that will pop up at the end of the GoToWebinar. We do take a look at those survey results. There's a section within there to provide any feedback. I always welcome any future topic ideas, whatever you would actually like to see us to present, because really this is to serve you, our customers, going forward. With that, let's jump into things here. My name is Guy Schrader. I am the Manager of Sales Engineering here with Navient. Really quick, the agenda that we're going to go through, really we're going to keep this at a high level. Workflow is a very, very broad topic. And I'll let you know right now, it's very difficult to demonstrate workflow because it is so versatile and it can do so many different things. So we're really going to be focusing more so on the concepts of workflow, sprinkling in through the presentation some real-life examples of how we've seen workflow being utilized within different organizations. We'll circle around, kind of do a recap, and leave hopefully enough time at the end for any questions and answers. So without any further ado, let's jump into things. What is workflow? Well, it's a very, very broad term again. I like to break this down into a few different pieces. Frankly, a relatively simple way to look at this is it's an electronic means to help automate a process that you might have. Now, just think, if you have a manual-based process, you're going to have subject matter experts that follow that process really, really well, but you have newer employees that might not follow that process very well whatsoever. Automating that really helps us now to ensure that everybody is following that same process from top to bottom, all the appropriate rules, the checks and balances take place. That's a real major benefit to automating workflow. Really, you could simplify things also and say it's the automated routing of documents from one person to the next. It's much broader than that, all things said and done. So I like to use the term also, it's a broad set of capabilities that can be used by any organization for a content-centric, repeatable process. And I think those last four words are really important. Content-centric, meaning we need to have some type of content, whether that be a document, whether that be data, and then a repeatable process. Given fewer exceptions, if it's a really, really dynamic process, there might be some other tools that could be utilized to help automate that process rather than workflow. So I like to start just with a really simplified workflow process because we all go through these processes on a daily basis throughout our life. One of my banes of my existence is my cellular service bill. Given I have a family plan, I have 2 kids, boy, do they use the data. So what do I do when I receive that bill on a monthly basis? This is my personal workflow. I take a look at it. There's more than one page. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of data on here, but what I'm really doing for starters is doing a comparison between the current bill and prior month's bills. I oftentimes go to the final line and say, did the dollar amount go up? If it didn't, I might not do anything further with it. But obviously what happens when I find out that my kids have used more than their allocation of data for the month and my bill now doubles in cost because of all that overage? Well, that starts a whole process now where I need to discuss things with my kids. So really taking that process and kind of simplifying it, I like to look at it this way. My process, I compare that total on this bill from the prior months. If it's different, I need to determine why. That's when I'm taking a look at the details. If it is different, I route that for review effectively. I'm going to my kids and yelling at them for using way too much data and then making some determinations for how are we going to pay that bill. My kids are old enough, they both have jobs, so I charge them for any data overage that they have. That's a really, really simplified process in my personal world. I'm sure that I can guarantee you that in a business workplace, your processes are very, very different, much more complex than that. But hopefully that paints a base picture of what workflow can do when we automate the process. So again, working through a lot of these different concepts, we really need to pose the first question: what can be routed through workflow? Well, all things said and done in the context of OnBase, because there are workflow systems available outside of OnBase, whether that be something with your ERP package or other line of business applications or another content management package. Frankly, any OnBase object can be routed through workflow. And what that really means, we're talking documents, really of any file type. It doesn't have to be a scanned document. It could be a Word document. It could be a video or an audio file. Highly doubtful that would go through a workflow, but you never know. A good example of something like that is going to be an invoice that your organization has to pay, similar to my cell phone bill. That document gets into the system in some form or fashion, whether that's scanned or whether that's received electronically via email. We have ingestion methods to get that into the system, but then once that document exists inside of OnBase, it's routed through the appropriate business process for review, approval, and finally payment of that invoice, again, simplifying the process. Those objects could be electronic forms. So think, rather than somebody submitting paper, if there's a form that's being filled out, we'll make that form available electronically and now start the whole process behind that. Think of an application for employment. Somebody completes that form on a website. They could attach their resume and other supporting documentation. That form automatically goes into workflow, potentially for setting up an interview with different individuals within the organization, maybe all the way through the hire process, and even potentially all the way through the onboarding process to make sure that that new employee has everything that they need for day one so that they hit the ground running. Another object that could be routed in the OnBase world is a WorkView object. For those people that know WorkView, it's more so data-centric modeling of information, very dynamic in nature, but a really good example of that, keeping it simple. Maybe you have built a WorkView application that's being used by your IT help desk for support tickets. A percentage of those tickets need to be audited in some form or fashion. Let workflow automatically take those tickets, the select number of tickets, and route them to the auditors to make sure that the process is being followed appropriately for your workflow ticketing application. Which leads us into, how can a workflow begin? We can take any of those different objects and they can automatically begin a workflow process. So getting a little more technical in the realm of OnBase, when we configure a document type, we can set that up to say enter a particular workflow when that document is first imported, or if we're doing batch processing, whether we're scanning in batch, maybe a document import processor process, cold processing, whatever the case might be. When that batch is committed, that's when those documents automatically go into workflow. And that's probably what happens most oftentimes the case. A good example of that would be the invoice. Every invoice, once it comes in, we need to follow this particular process. But there are going to be some cases where you want to have more of an ad hoc method for adding documents into workflow. And really what we're talking about there is after performing a search for a document inside of OnBase, whether you have one document, whether you have 100 documents, there's something called a system task that could take those selected documents and automatically push them into whatever the configured workflow that might be out there. So there's the right time and the right place for both of these methods for getting documents into the system. I like to sprinkle in some of the key components here also, because one of the real benefits to workflow is to be able to bring to the user all of the content that they need to most effectively make their decision. And related documents is a great concept of that. What we're talking about is that now within the workflow interface, not only are they seeing that primary object that got routed through workflow, but all of the other related content that might be necessary to view in order to make that informed decision. So bring all of that content to the user. Think of the alternative. If that information is not being delivered to you, you're looking at something and saying, oh, geez, I need to look at this and this and this. Well, you exit workflow. You go back and search for that related content, maybe make some notes in the process, and then come back to workflow and make your appropriate decision. Well, that's very inefficient, all things said and done. So if we can bring that to everybody and it works that much quicker, and how we do that in OnBase is through what are called work folders. Based upon that primary object coming into the system, we can retrieve all of the related content, typically based upon some related keywords between these different document types and these different objects. That is delivered into the system as a related document within the work folder. The user can choose then to view whichever content that they need to, and there's also the capability of looking at that in the side-by-side viewer. So just to give you some visual representation of what that looks like for those people that haven't used OnBase or used workflow, just a couple things to highlight here. This is the landing page for OnBase and the Unity client. You'll see highlighted there up on the top, workflow is accessible directly from that Unity client just through a button click. Alternatively, you could use what are called personal pages in some of these panels, like that invoice approval. That can be added to an individual user's personal page where now they can choose to say, hey, I'm working within this invoice approval process. Give me, right when I log into the system, at least a visual of how much work that I have to perform and related to this invoice approval process. Regardless of which way that you go into the system, it's going to bring you into the workflow interface and show you a very similar look and feel. And given I don't want to focus on this too much, mainly because there is so much configurability within the workflow view inside of OnBase, people can really customize their screens where things actually appear. But to call your focus here, obviously we're looking at that document on the right-hand side of the screen. That's our primary document that's being routed through workflow. But notice down at the bottom and lower left-hand corner, we have something called related items. Again, this could appear a little bit differently on your screen, but when I go in there, that gives me the opportunity to not only view that primary document, but in a split screen mode, be able to view any of the other related documents related to this invoice. Based upon the purchase order number, I've retrieved the packing slip. I can view that information. Or I can select the purchase order, which you can see, different file type. This is an electronic form that might have been our PO process. But again, that user now is being brought to them all of the necessary information for them to appropriately make their decision in a very efficient manner. So let's get into some different workflow concepts here. Again, this is really, really broad, and we're going to start really at the high level of talking about rules and actions. So once a document gets into workflow, workflow can be configured with any variety of different rules and actions to dictate what happens with these different objects that are traveling through workflow. And really a rule at that highest level is utilizing some if-then logic. We present the system a rule, and then based upon whether that rule was evaluated as true or false, potentially different things can happen here. So to use a really good example, if you're dealing with a contracts type of workflow, if the contract type is a non-disclosure agreement, then you need to follow the configured logic for an NDA versus any other contract type. That might go a whole different route and different process. It's all within the same workflow process, but we use those rules to take different paths. Or something different. Has this document been approved by somebody throughout the process? If so, we're going to do something. If not, we're going to do something else. And again, that's where we get into the minutia of specifically what do you need as an organization to have the workflow do when we have that document being approved. And that's difficult for me to demonstrate without really understanding your scenario. Keep in mind, you can have rules within rules. So we call them nested rules. So there could be really, really complex logic where if this evaluates yes, if this evaluates yes underneath that, if so, then I do this. So you can get really, really complex in what actually happens with those rules. Now, a few other things to highlight here. What can I evaluate on for a rule? So I just like to use the term evaluators. Quite simply, just starting from the simplest and getting more complex, you can prompt the user with a question. That is truly a rule saying yes or no, which question is right. Whether they answer yes or no may very well dictate what happens next. So a good example, prompt the user, does this order need to be rushed? If yes, we're going to follow a rush process. If no, let's follow the normal process. It's a really simple evaluator. A lot of these evaluators can be set up to happen automatically. So based upon the keywords that have already been recorded for this specific document, we can look at them and then make the appropriate determination. So we can check that keyword either on the primary document or any of those related documents. Remember before I was talking about those related documents that are coming in that are associated with that primary object. We can look at keyword values on those related documents also. So a good example here, an invoice situation. Maybe there's a rule inside of your organization that any invoice that's over $10,000, the CFO has to view that. If not, hey, we just complete the process. Anything under that, whatever's happened up to this point, perfectly fine, finish off that process. So that's a good example of a keyword evaluation. A few more. We can also take a look at different system or document properties for evaluators. And a really good example of that is looking at dates, how long something has been within a particular queue, maybe some user information. There's a number of system or document properties that we can utilize. Here's a good example. Has the item been sitting in this particular queue for more than 48 hours? If so, we're going to go ahead and take some different action. And we'll talk about some of the different things that can happen automatically in just a few moments. There's also properties. Given this is a bit more of an advanced topic, I don't really want to get into it, but really think if any of these other evaluators don't work or we need to do some more complex calculations, that's where properties can come into play. Use those as evaluators for making the appropriate decision on what might happen next, depending upon how that is actually evaluated. In OnBase 18, there are 79 pre-configured rules, and I'd like just to highlight this because workflow, some people think of workflow and it can be daunting. It really can because it is relatively big, but the key is that OnBase has developed their workflow tool where everything is pre-configured. We need to select the appropriate rule at the appropriate point within the workflow logic, and then it's almost like a wizard that walks us through the rest of the different parameters for that particular pre-configured rule. So there's a lot that's already there out of the box that helps us to configure these rules. Let's switch gears for a moment here. Let's talk about actions. And what are those? This is what actually happens, okay? We can evaluate the different rules, but that's not really doing anything besides saying yes or no, okay? When something is evaluated yes or no, then we actually do something. Now, given actions don't require rules. We could actually have an action performed right behind a button click or when the document comes into the system. But again, we can invoke that based upon a rule evaluating true. And there can be multiple actions performed automatically by the system when either, again, somebody invokes it manually or when a rule evaluates true. So a good example, think all these actions can take place automatically. Maybe we set the status to approved. We add an approved note to the document, and maybe even prompt the user for any comments, and that's going to now appear as a note layer on top of that document. We can automatically send a notification then back to the requester saying this item was approved, and then remove that item from workflow. Those four things happen in sequence when they're configured just as four separate actions. I don't really have to do anything more than that than configured initially. Every time whatever fired that, those four actions take place. Again, in OnBase 18, there are 220 pre-configured actions. So you really take a look at everything inside of workflow. You have 300, roughly, rules and actions that are pre-configured that just need to be associated with your workflow process and configured accordingly. So, some further concepts. We've talked rules, we've talked actions. Really, we need to come back and talk about a life cycle. Given a life cycle is that overall process. Inside of that life cycle, that's how we configure the system to process the documents. And we configure that based upon the document types. Again, this goes back to one of the first conversations we had today. We configure the document type to go into workflow. Ultimately, it goes into that life cycle. Now, just a couple things to point out. An object, a document, a work view record, an electronic form can only be in one place within a single life cycle. Okay, so take just a second to absorb that. I cannot have that document in two places inside that one life cycle. However, I can take that object and have it in multiple different life cycles at the same time. Okay, just something key to keep in mind here. So that allows us to do some concurrent workflow routing, assuming that we have multiple different life cycles. Inside of a life cycle, we have queues, and these, all things said and done, are different stopping places, stopping points or inboxes within the process where something happens. Okay, every queue that you configure is going to be associated with a unique life cycle. So again, I have multiple different stopping points within this process, within that life cycle. There we go. And I wanted to point out also that there are permissions set up inside of OnBase to determine who has rights to each of these different queues, even to the different actions or ad hoc tasks that might take place. So keep in mind, without getting into the details, that granular security can be set up. And then when documents enter a queue, there can be rules and actions configured that can be executed automatically or behind button clicks when an object resides within a queue. So I kind of built this a little bit backwards, but I think it's important to understand some of these concepts, and now we're kind of putting the pieces back together. So within a queue, there can be automated rules and actions when a document first enters that queue. We call that system work. When the document or object comes into the queue, we may very well evaluate any rules that are configured and then perform the appropriate actions that might be there. Something else that can take place, we might have timer work set up. So think of the case where we want to make sure that work is being performed in a timely fashion. That timer is actually configured to run on a scheduled basis. Whenever that timer runs, we configure rules and actions to make the appropriate determination what happens next. A good example of that might be saying, hey, if something's been sitting in this queue for more than 48 hours again, send a notification to somebody else. Maybe they forgot about it. Or maybe escalate this to somebody. Maybe somebody's on vacation. That would all be behind something like timer work. Given there can be a manual evaluation also, and we really term those ad hoc tasks. The user, when they're viewing that object inside of workflow, is given the option to select an ad hoc task, which again, behind that button click, we can have rules and actions configured to perform whatever the appropriate task might be. There can be multiple ad hoc tasks presented to a user per queue, and each of those ad hoc tasks has security configured behind it, so I might only have specific ad hoc tasks that I can actually perform. Maybe my manager can perform more. So again, keep that in mind. So let's look at a couple screenshots here. Again, we're back into that same interface that we saw before, but let me just paint the full picture here. And again, if you're using OnBase, it might look a little bit different, but the same concepts reside. As I'm taking a look at something within that yellow box there, that AP invoice processing, that is my life cycle that contains a number of queues. Everything that I see beneath that is queues. Now, given I have permissions that I have visibility to all those different queues, but invoice exceptions is a good example. The one that's selected, that is the current queue that I am in. Within that particular queue, I see my inbox. These are the 4 items that are currently sitting in this invoices exception queue. From there, I'm then presented with the different ad hoc tasks as I'm working this Office Max invoice that I see on the right-hand side here. You can see I have 6 different ad hoc tasks that I can perform depending upon how my workflow is configured, where I might need to send that to my ERP, attach a note, send that for somebody else for review, submit for approval, so on and so forth. And that's where things would differ drastically within your organization, depending upon where you are within the process and what we want to allow the user to take action on. So we're starting to wrap up here. I just wanted to go through a few of the different benefits here for workflow automation. And I think that I forgot, my transitions are a little bit out of sync here. one of the main benefits is that everybody is now following that same process. Again, in a manual world, God only knows whether each employee is following the appropriate steps. We can ensure that that is followed to a T when we automate workflow. With all of this, you have an entire workflow history. We know when documents got to certain individuals within these different queues, who caused it to go into the queue. The same thing for when something goes out of the queue, which gives us some great process metrics. There's also workflow log entries. If we really want to ensure that I know who approved a document, we can add workflow log entries. All of this is stored inside of the OnBase database, which then allows us to generate reports. We have high visibility to where things stand within the process. I think you know what the current state might be, what kind of work is outstanding, how long have things been in queue, who's has a lot of work, so on and so forth. And historically, you can also see what happened over time. Were there any bottlenecks within the process? How do my different employees compare to each other for the amount of work that they're performing or how long it takes them to perform the work? Are there trends happening? Am I seeing more business coming through where I might need to consider additional headcount within my organization? Those are really a lot of the major benefits that you see with automating your workflows. And one of my last slides here, I just wanted to make sure that we position things accordingly, that you need to do some planning for workflow. This is not just a case where you say, I'm going to automate this process. I'm going to go into OnBase or whatever that system might be and configure it. There's a lot more to this, folks, to do it effectively. You need to understand and document that current process. Hopefully a lot of you already have that current state documentation put together, but somebody needs to sit down and really understand that. Don't just automate a process that is not efficient. Now you have an automated inefficient process if you do that. So take every opportunity to improve that process at that point in time and really then sit back and do a little bit of a checkpoint. Is there really value in automating this process? If there's really low volumes, if there's only a handful of items that come through on a monthly basis, probably not going to be a lot of value in automating that. But a highly complex process, a lot of volume, a lot of people getting involved, and you have issues with reporting, yeah, absolutely, there is value in automating something like that. Determine what the future state's going to look like and document that. And one of the reasons that you need to document that is that then you can present that to your business leaders and agree on what that future state might look like. If you don't have that in your process for planning for workflow, I can almost guarantee you people are going to come back and effectively have lots of changes, scope creep to that particular process. So agree upon that and get it documented and then start your configuration. We always recommend that you configure in a non-production environment. Go through extensive testing, making sure that every different scenario works as anticipated. And once you've concluded your testing, then you can migrate that to your production environment, go live. But then I also think it's important to have as-built documentation because, again, after things are live, somebody then comes back saying, well, this isn't functioning properly. You can present them with the as-built documentation saying, yes, it is, based upon how it's configured. Now, albeit, if something is broken and that's not working properly, that allows you to come back in and now take a look at the troubleshooting related to that. This is my last slide here. So think of any questions that you might have and start posing them within the questions section. Some additional considerations. Given Navient, we do this. We work with many of you on workflow configuration, that planning beforehand. That's really what our forte is. So keep us in mind going forward. Now, given you can go out and get trained on workflow itself. OnBase provides that training. Check out training.onbase.com. They have their entire schedule out there. But experience definitely plays into this. Don't expect to go get trained and you're going to be able to configure every single workflow known to man. There are things that you learn as time goes by. So you get more efficient the more that you do this, more experience where you're going to be able to configure things more efficiently as time goes on. With that, I just wanted to do a quick pitch. If you haven't seen the flyers yet or the emailing, Navient is hosting our annual summit this year at the Monona Terrace in Madison. The dates on that are October 15th and 16th. Please register for that. It's a free event. We just ask that you register so that we can plan accordingly. And with that, we are to questions and answers. So let me see if I have any questions that have come through. At this point in time, no questions. I must have done a fabulous job of explaining things. But I will stick on this GoToWebinar for at least a few more minutes if you have any questions whatsoever. Otherwise, I always feel free to reach out to your Navient account executive. They're more than happy to talk about workflow with you and see how we can actually assist or answer any questions that you might have. With that, we're right at 10:30 Central Time. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. I hope that everybody walks away having learned something, and we hope to hear from you again in a future Navient webinar. Thanks so much. Have a great day.